I'd love to welcome you to our second Cutting Green Tape Exchange. We're expecting more than 250 people today. So just a few Zoom etiquette reminders. If I could ask that you please stay on mute so that not everyone gets to enjoy your conversations. And I encourage everyone to engage in respectful use of the chat box. We're going to be using the chat box throughout the day. And just a reminder that today's presentations are all being recorded and they'll be made available to you following the exchange. My name is Sharon Farrell. I work with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm on the steering committee for the California Landscape Stewardship Network. For those of you not familiar with the network, we're a volunteer-led network of approximately 30 different landscape stewardship networks who collectively are coordinating efforts to increase the pace, the scale, and the quality of cross-boundary landscape stewardship throughout the state. Our mission is centered around peer exchange and how to shift paradigms, plus address shared obstacles through engaging in systems thinking and forging equitable solutions to collaboratively steward California's cherished places. The network's role with Cutting Green Tape has been to catalyze and elevate conversations, offer opportunities to convene like today, and to collaboratively prepare implementation recommendations from the 2019 and 2020 roundtables, which were captured in the Cutting Green Tape Regulatory Efficiencies for a Resilient Environment report. We recognize that the success of Cutting Green Tape rests in part on engaging in many conversations with broad audiences, risk-taking, testing and adapting new approaches, and growing from our learnings. If you're new to Cutting Green Tape, please see background information reports and webinars that are located on both the Natural Resources Agency and the California Network websites. Secretary Crowfoot is here today to kick off today's exchange with a brief introduction. And as many of you know, that it was his visionary leadership that was catalytic to not only beginning the Cutting Green Tape initiative, but also really leading the agency's work in biodiversity, inclusive access, and other key initiatives. Secretary Crowfoot was also instrumental in launching and catalyzing the 2019 and 2020 Cutting Green Tape roundtables. Following his remarks, we'll review the agenda for today. This and the facilitation of today's exchange will be provided by Shawn Johnson. Shawn helped facilitate the Cutting Green Tape roundtables and the first exchange, and he's also on the steering committee for the California Landscape Stewardship Network. Plus, he teaches at the University of Montana and serves as a leader for the National Network for Landscape Conservation. And again, if I could just remind folks, as you've joined, just to please mute yourself. I can hear a few things in the background. It'll just make it easier for everybody to hear all of the exciting presentations from today and to enjoy the exchange. Okay, with that, now let's kick off today's program with Secretary Crowfoot.
Sharon, great to be with you and great to be with everyone. And I love the chat function because it gives us a sense of who's on and where they're coming from. You have Sarah up in the Klamath Basin who spent the summer developing beaver dam analogs. I actually know what that is as a result of a recent tour. Everyone down to Jake in the San Joaquin River Parkway and so many folks in between and even people out of the state. Let me start by disagreeing with you, Sharon, which is, you know, of course you're going to give the credit to the guy who's in charge of the agency, but it was actually, you know, your vision, the Landscape Stewardship Network's vision around really raising up this issue of needing to move more quickly at larger scale on environmental restoration. And I feel like our job or our role in our agency was simply giving that vision some amplification. And so that's really that started us on the journey that we're on. I want to acknowledge that, you know, this effort on the state side is shared across agencies. Joaquin Esquivel and the team at the Water Board have been moving mountains. We'll hear about that. Chuck Bonham and his team at Fish and Wildlife, same. Karen Ross, the governor's agriculture secretary, has always been a passionate supporter of this. And of course, Jared Blumenfeld, my partner in crime over at Cal EPA. I know Shalana Da Silva, his key new climate deputy, is on the phone as well. And then we have so many partners, and just a shout out to Karen Burr, who leads the Resource Conservation District Association across the state. This is really a remarkable set of folks outside of state government and inside of state government. So I'm supposed to set the frame for the discussion, and I usually do that off the cuff, but I have to say my colleague Jen Norris, who is our first ever Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat, put together such good talking points. I'm actually going to read them because I actually think they organize our thinking and sort of the driving vision behind this Cutting the Green Tape really well. So first of all, we know that the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report called the climate crisis a code red for humanity. I would modify that and call this a code red for humanity and nature. We know that California is on the front lines of this crisis. Our human communities are threatened like never before, but so are our natural communities. Our human communities threatened by catastrophic wildfire, worsening drought, extreme temperatures, and our natural biodiversity, which makes our state a biodiversity hotspot, similarly challenged by this crisis. Compared to other states, we have a higher total number of species than any other state and the highest number of endemic species. So the work that we're doing to protect and restore biodiversity, never more important. I don't have to recite for you just how challenging this climate crisis is, but I will say that this drought, the catastrophic wildfire crisis, extreme temperatures are impacting our nature and our people in ways that we never thought possible really until later in the century. Science that we funded at the state that to project climate impacts, projected impacts that we're now experiencing. Some of those estimates were suggesting that we would be experiencing these impacts 80 years into the future by the end of next century. So we know the climate crisis is accelerating, and we are in danger of losing a key part of what makes California, California, which is this tremendous ecological richness we have. So to me, the crisis has never been greater, but then I'll shift to saying the opportunity has never been greater as well. We know habitat restoration can be a key antidote to the climate impacts. Nature can help us address climate change, but we have to let it. We have to help nature save ourselves. We have to reverse the damage done to our ecosystems and natural systems and restore those ecosystems for the benefit of plants and animals, but also to buffer us from floods and sea level rise, clean our air and water. So I would say, while we should give ourselves some level of credit for making progress, winning slowly is actually losing. In other words, the scale and severity of the crises we face mean we have to move more quickly at greater scale on environmental restoration than we ever have. And that's fundamentally what cutting the green tape is about. It's about how do we allow environmental restoration to take place more quickly and cost effectively to effectively address environmental degradation. I am really gratified that since we launched this Cutting the Green Tape effort across our agencies, that I think we've captured the imagination of a lot of our colleagues here in state government and a lot of external partners, many of whom are represented on the phone. So today we're going to talk about some of the progress we've made over the last year. And I want to just personally thank Dr. Norris, Jen Norris, who came on board as our Deputy Secretary of Biodiversity and Habitat, not only for her work spearheading the 30 by 30 effort, which we can talk about at some point today, but also for her partnership with Landscape Stewardship Network and so many others to drive Cutting the Green Tape. We'll hear that Department of Fish and Wildlife has made real substantive progress on its first ever program focused on grant funding and permitting for restoration. DFW recognizes that it can improve its processes in its own house to help deliver restoration more quickly. The Water Board has been an absolute leader on this effort, and we understand that its 401 draft general order for large aquatic restoration project has undergone public review. This is this sort of programmatic permitting that's going to allow individual projects to take place more quickly. And then hot off the presses with the budget approval last week, we have our first ever pilot CEQA exemption for certain habitat restoration. Important to note that that pilot CEQA exemption probably generates a lot of questions, and we're going to spend some time in coming weeks really unpacking how state agencies are going to pursue that pilot exemption for certain projects carefully and thoughtfully. So stay tuned for that deeper dive in coming weeks. But that particular step forward, in combination with all of this other work that's happening across agencies, we think will make a difference and is actually already starting to make a difference. So huge thanks, Sharon, to the Stewardship Network, but then also really all the partners here on the Zoom. I'll speak for myself. The work happening across the state happens at the local level. It happens at the regional level. It happens because groups are making it happen. So our goal is to empower you to get more done more quickly, and just excited for continued progress. Thanks.
Thanks, Wade. Really appreciate you welcoming everyone. And one of the things that I'm reflecting on here is just how leadership is coming from so many corners of the state, not just the state agencies, but from so many of the folks who have joined us here today too. So thank you for being part of this conversation, many of you from the beginning. Hi again, I'm Shawn Johnson. Sharon introduced me just a minute ago. I'll be helping facilitate today's conversation. Joining you from Helena, Montana today. I'm part of the University of Montana, and I have the privilege and the honor, both on and off campus, to work with groups like this who are thinking about how do we work more effectively across sectors, scales, silos, and jurisdictions to achieve better outcomes for people and for nature. And the work that's happening with this group, with the Cutting Green Tape Initiative and through partnerships like the California Landscape Stewardship Network is such an important part of that story. One of the things that I was thinking about is, as we move from those conversations of thinking about what is it that we can do together to actually doing that work, we need to continue to foster conversations and exchanges like this so that we can continue the learning, so that we can share lessons, so that we can benefit from gaining the insight and knowledge that we're creating in those individual conversations and in partnership with others, but bring that back to this community and really foster a community that learns together and a community that acts together. We're trying a couple of new things with our format today in terms of the structure of this so that we can foster that exchange and that learning. One of the things that you're all seeing is that it was by accident, obviously, but trying new features on Zoom, and this one today, higher degree of difficulty, was that you were entered into the Zoom room with your mute off. And so everyone got to join live and have their voice on the phone or on the Zoom screen. Apologize for how that disrupted some of the early comments from Sharon and Secretary Crowfoot, but I think we got the core messages that you guys were communicating, and we'll look to correct that for future efforts. But we do have a lot of fun interactive things beyond that planned for you today. The chat box, you're already jumping in and really providing some real-time feedback and input right away. You'll see a link to a news story, you'll see updates from people, you'll see a number of things in there. That's also where we'll be dropping the link to the Poll Everywhere questions that we're going to be jumping into here in just a second. To give us a sense of what we're up to today, I'm going to have Devin pull up an agenda slide for us, and we'll just walk through what we'd like to structure here in front of us. So Devin, thanks so much for pulling that up. All right, so look at us making progress already. We've had our welcome from Secretary Crowfoot, and then looking at the key features of our agenda today, going to turn pretty quickly here to Deputy Secretary Norris for some reflections on the progress that we've made to date and some high-level thoughts from her and the perspective that she's holding as one of the leaders in this initiative. And then a new feature, our first real new feature here are these lightning talks on cutting green tape efforts. So really introducing the idea that for us to be able to build knowledge together, we've really got to gain quick insight into what's happening in different dimensions. And so we've invited some leaders to come forward with some really well-crafted comments and a synthesis of what they're doing in a way that we can build that knowledge together and share some quick updates. Throughout the conversation, we'll be looking to you guys with polls here and there too, so be on the lookout for those. You'll also remember that part of the way we're trying to gather your insights and knowledge is by reaching out in between meetings. And so we'll want to share some of what we learned from the survey that was distributed before today's event. What you're thinking about, what's on your mind, the things that you're doing, the work that you're advancing. So just share back what we've heard from all of you. And then we're moving to what we're calling a moderated Q&A session on some of the efforts that are really starting to demonstrate the impact of the Cutting Green Tape initiative. And so we've got moderated panel with a facilitator moderator and a couple of panelists that are going to be exploring some key dimensions of their work, bringing that forward to you all in more of a discussion format so that we can really emulate what you'd see in like a a daytime talk show format or something like that. That's just a little bit more conversational, a little bit more of that synthesis that we're looking for that helps build our shared understanding and knowledge as we move forward. And then we'll round out the day with just a little bit of a recap of what else is in the works, how we're continuing to advance the conversation in real time, what some of those milestones are, and what to be looking out for as we move forward. Obviously, you guys are all a key part of this, and we want to learn a little bit about you, not just in between meetings and in surveys, but as we go. And so we've queued up a couple of just check-in questions with you to learn a little bit more about who's in the room today. And so Devin, if you wouldn't mind dropping the link into the chat box to the Poll Everywhere questions, and then we'll give people a minute to jump over there. Not too much of an in-depth inquiry today, but really want to get a sense of who's in the room and start with a really basic question. Just checking in with you all on how you're doing. And looks like Devin just dropped that in there. So if you click on the link that just got dropped into the chat box, it will take you to a Poll Everywhere question. And the first one is, how's your day going? How are you? And we want to start here just recognizing that, gosh, these are still really complicated times, and you guys are jumping from another meeting, another worry, another discussion, and yet you've carved out time to be with us here today and just saying, hey, we care about that. We care about what is going on in your lives and what you're bringing into this conversation. And just recognizing that there's a lot of complexity, anxiety, and worry that we're holding in the world, even as we're trying to advance these things. So seeing a lot of smiley faces coming in, some people who are more middle of the road. I think I've been in at least 4 of those different buckets just today in terms of my own mood and how I'm feeling about the world and the work in front of me. But thanks for being here. Thanks for showing up. And thanks for bringing, a smiley face or mostly smiley face to the room just now. I know that when I look out the room or I look on the Zoom screen here, it does bring me a bit of a smile on my own face just to see all the work that's happening out there. Then the next question is just, gosh, California is a huge state. The idea of beneficial restoration and regulatory effectiveness is a huge issue that really permeates all corners of the state. How do we do that? Well, we each pick up a piece of it from where we are and with the organization and the agent or the agency that we're working with, or on behalf of a partnership that we're involved in. And so this is just a quick look of, we've got 157 people online now, where you're joining us from throughout the state of California, and it looks like even beyond. So thanks so much for being here. Just let those keep dropping for a second. All right. Looks like it's slowing down. So let's go to the last one, Devin. So we think that there may be some people here who are joining for the first time, and yeah, we're seeing that in real time here. This is a collective effort, and we also know that not everyone can jump into every meeting every time. And so we've got a variable level of past experience, of real in-depth knowledge of the conversations that have happened. And then we've got some people who are joining us for the first time who are maybe interested in learning more and seeing how this conversation and these exchanges can benefit your work, connect to your partnerships, connect to your agency priorities and mission, all of those different things. So quite a few people joining for the first time. Want to give a special shout out. Welcome to those folks. A couple of people, this is just their second one. A lot of people have been here for 2 to 4 conversations and events, and it's great to see all of you back here and continue to be a part of these conversations. And then we've got our overachievers there at the bottom, 5 or plus of these conversations. Thanks so much for everything that you've contributed to these conversations and efforts as we move forward. So we're going to be returning to this Poll Everywhere feature just throughout this, recognizing that with 157 people online, it's a great way to connect with you real quickly, gain some instant feedback, and hear a little bit about you and bring your voice into a conversation with others. With that, I do want to switch gears real quickly and introduce a longtime caller. I'm going to call her a longtime caller to the Cutting the Green Tape Conversations, Jen Norris. Welcome back to the stage here. Just going to have you start by reintroducing yourself and especially saying hi to some of those new folks that have joined us, and then go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. And so great to see everyone again. I am personally really looking forward to the time when we convene in person and there are those great tacos. I still remember those from a year. How long ago was that now? Almost 2. Anyway, I am Jennifer Norris, Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency, which is a really great gig. I love my job. It gives me an opportunity to talk to people all over the state about important habitat restoration work we're doing, and of course, all of our efforts to protect biodiversity, which so many faces on this screen, inside and outside of government, are obviously a big part of. So really wonderful. One of my responsibilities is this Cutting Green Tape initiative, which if it's your first time, you're in for, I hope, a really good 2 hours. There's going to be a lot of information packed in. Sort of fundamentally, Cutting Green Tape is really about looking to improve our processes, our policies, and if necessary, our regulations to implement restoration more quickly, efficiently, and effectively. So it's really about recognizing what the Secretary mentioned, you know, the need to restore habitat throughout the state and you know, steward that land into the future and making sure that the environmental rules we have in place aren't impeding that good work. And so, you know, not to undercut any of the rules, but actually make sure we're using them in the most effective way and moving things along. So one of the big exciting things about our budget this year is actually that we've got about almost $1 billion for habitat restoration across the state. So cutting the green tape is more important than ever. You know, we really need to demonstrate that we can spend that money and restore habitat and put it to the good use, the purposes that it was allocated for. And so you're going to hear from a lot of different people today. I'm not going to go through a big long list of all the great accomplishments because these lightning talks are really going to focus on some of those. I'm really personally excited about the work that DFW is doing. They've really taken some pilot money that the legislature allocated and just done incredible things. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Chad, but also from partners all over. There's just a lot of great work going on. I'm going to take advantage of this screen to just highlight one of the things that's actually happening at the California Natural Resources Agency that you might not know about, and maybe as a candidate for a future lightning talk, which is that the organizations under CNRA meet fairly regularly, the folks that do bonds and grants, and talk about ways we can streamline and improve our grant funding processes. So this includes working on pre-application and consultation phases to reduce the amount of time and resources that grant seekers spend and help them in writing their grant applications. So we work across the portfolio programs in CNRA to collaborate on best practices, track outcomes, and look to build more efficiencies. One of the things that's underway that we hope to showcase soon, it's being built right now, is what we're calling the Resources Agency Project Tracking and Reporting System, shorthand RAPTOR. This has been underway for a couple of years, and I will tell you, as a former person who tracked projects, a tear came to my eye when I was briefed about this program because it sounds amazing. This is going to be a tool that allows us to compile project level information, track performance metrics, allow us to assess progress made toward meeting our restoration goals. And we're also going to use it to track how we're doing on cutting green tape. So this is a really exciting thing that's underway, sort of on the backside of the agency, but it's something that I'm personally looking forward to see us roll out. So I'm going to take just a couple more minutes and tell you about me and some of my perspective on cutting green tape and why this conversation is so important. So before I got to this position, I was a regulator for 16 years. I worked at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I started out actually in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and most of my early, we call them biological opinions at the feds, essentially our permits for work, were actually on restoration projects on the Middle Rio Grande in New Mexico. I permitted probably a dozen projects over my time. And then later I moved to California and worked throughout, oversaw the Sacramento office. So I was in the Central Valley and the Sierras, throughout the Bay Area, working on all kinds of projects. And mostly because staffing was always so short and we were always without enough money to do all the work we had to do. We were always looking for ways to be more efficient and effective at delivering the same results, just with less paperwork if possible. So I've been part of building, programmatic biological opinions that were highlighted in the the PPIC report that just came out recently on advancing restoration, right? Doing those multiple projects that are kind of the same over and over again. How can we gather those up into one document and not just keep cranking out the same thing? Part of that, part of big programs like the Mid-Peninsular Open Space District, all their operations and maintenance. We delivered one big opinion that just said, here's all the permitting you need from the feds in one place. And then of course I got to be part of some really powerful interagency teams that tackled complex permitting issues. And I tell you all this background to say that I come to this with a lot of experience and a lot of understanding about just how hard it actually is. You know, the rules are complicated and they're never written to work together. So multiple agencies are always struggling to try to just do their part, and they never have enough resources. It's challenging. And so I think about folks that are trying to get permits, and this project is your project and it means a lot to you, but the people that are doing that permitting, they're getting hit from a lot of different angles. And so one thing that I thought I would just share is I think there's sort of a few key things that are really important to bring to this conversation and to be thinking about, which is that I think we all really care about conservation. We all really care about the environment, about nature, about protecting these species and places that we all hold dear, whether you're a permitter, whether you're a land steward, whether you're working on a restoration project, we all care. And so I think it's really important to start from that place always whenever we work together. The other thing I really believe is that people can be really creative if they have just a little bit of breathing room to do so. And that's when I point to the CDFW work. They got just a little bit of money to really start accelerating their creativity, and I think it's starting to pay off. And then finally, I think, you know, communication is the most important part of the whole game, which is why these exchanges are so important. It's important to build trust, to be able to share your insights, share where you don't know what you're talking about so that people can come together and figure it out together. You know, we're all on this journey together. And so having conversations like these are so important. I just want to thank the California Landscape Stewardship Network again for creating this space for us to understand each other better, hear each other, share ideas. It's really important, and hopefully will help us succeed in getting California nature back where we need it to be. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Shawn. I hit the 1:30 mark. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're amazing at hitting all those cues. Really appreciate that. And thanks so much for your words too, Jen. I mean, you had me at Taco Bar, but you kept me engaged with, you know, $1 billion in restoration efforts coming in, a lot of new support coming from the department, including this new tracking technology. I love the acronym RAPTOR, not going to forget that. And then the 3 C's that you introduced around care, creativity, and communication. And I would say that those are all in service to the community we're building here online and in our communities and in our network. So thanks so much for that framing. I think those are all great reminders as we think about how challenging this work can be, but how the intentions behind it are what's going to continue to fuel us to be creative and solve the tough challenges ahead. So thanks so much. And here we are transitioning right away to these lightning talks. And it's hard not to envision a coming thunderstorm when you see the phrase lightning talks. And so we've got 4 people coming up here who are going to be sharing a little bit of lightning and maybe a little bit of the drama that comes with a thunderstorm as well. Hopefully not intimidate them, but invite them to come forward with some really compelling things for us to think about and learn about. So we've got 4 folks lined up here. Here they are on the screen. We'll start at the top and go to the bottom. So Chad's going to kick us off here. That update that we just heard a little bit of a preview of from Jen on what's happening over at CDFW. And then Phil Crater is going to come on and share a little bit about the general order and how that General Order 401 and how that relates to cutting green tape and other things happening within water resources. Madeline Cavalieri is going to come on next and share a little bit about what's happening from the Coastal Commission perspective and permitting pathways for coastal zone projects. And we'll round things out with Matt Clifford on landowner liability. So that's the quick lineup. And I'm going to get out of the way and just say thanks so much to you all for putting together 3 to 5 minutes of really concise things to share with this group as we continue to grow together and learn together. Chad, over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for having me. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chad Dibble. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ecosystem Conservation Division at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I'll just start with saying I continue to be humbled at your request to participate in these meetings and be a part of this dialogue over the last couple of years. So thank you for that. I thought I'd focus my short time today on giving you some perspective of what the department is utilizing to help navigate how we continue this restoration journey. All totaled, we have about 4 somewhat similar, but unique in their own way, recommendations or requirements that are really shaping our cutting the green tape efforts. As you are aware, the November 2020 Regulatory Efficiencies report identified 14 recommendations that hit home in a lot of areas for CDFW. Subsequently, in January of this year, Secretary Crowfoot issued a call to action to the Natural Resources Agency departments, which we're a part of, to advance an initial subset of those 14 recommendations in efforts to expedite environmental conservation and restoration in California. However, what some of you may not know is that prior to that, and both of those documents coming out, CDFW had already began working with a set of stakeholders in the restoration community to develop and promote improvements to the efficiency and effectiveness of our grant programs and the projects they support. That year-long effort also resulted in 18 recommendations to the department that centered around grant program prioritization, grant administration, permitting, and engineering. And then most recently, with the Budget Act of 2021, and the inclusion of our first ever permanent funding to exclusively work on restoration granting and permitting, was a legislative reporting requirement that identifies specific measures and metrics that the department must report on annually for 6 years. So really, it's the culmination of these documents, the recommendations, and the continued dialogue with all of you that has and continues to shape our cutting the green tape efforts. So the question that everybody has is, how are we doing? And to that, I would say personally that we're doing quite well. I think we've spent a tremendous amount of time really taking all these recommendations to heart and working them through. We've continued our efforts to support the State Board on Recommendation 6 for a Restoration General Order. In response to Recommendation 7, we've developed the first ever CDFW Restoration Management Permit, or RMP, that is being piloted as we speak on several projects. And I'm happy to say that we've actually issued a permit for one of those projects, the Redwood Risings project, which is a project that will restore up to 80,000 acres of forest and riparian habitat on the North Coast. We've made structural changes to how CDFW processes grant agreements and amendments. And our hope is that we will see a reduced process time of approximately 40% in those areas. And lastly, we're revising our grant application process to create a more simplified, streamlined application that includes early consultation. Some of you are actually going through this right now with the release of our Cutting the Green Tape PSN. So I think my take-home message to you is that CDFW spent the last year really taking all of these recommendations to heart and began in earnest to start tackling these issues and finding solutions. With the PSN we have out now, this is where we believe the rubber really hits the road. It is this next phase of grant projects and the onboarding of our 18 new Cutting the Green Tape staff that we will begin to test all of these improvements and efficiencies that we've been working on over the last year. And this truly does run the gamut from the solicitation phase to the grant management phase to project planning to project implementation and permitting. So with that quick update, I think I'll turn it back to our facilitator and just end by saying thank you again for having me. It's great to see all of you.
Thank you, Chad. What an amazing update and what a great synthesis of everything that's happening across the department right now in 5 minutes or less. I mean, really modeled, I think, in a very effective lightning talk. So impressed across the board with everything that's permeating and percolating throughout the department. 18 new staff, this idea of 14 or 40% reduction in review time for some of these processes, a lot of streamlining, a lot of efficiency and effectiveness measures being built in there. So awesome. Just a note for our listening audience here, we are going to check in with you at the end of these lightning talks for you to just share any questions that you have or key takeaways or what really resonated with you from these lightning talks. So if you heard something from Chad just now or from our future speakers, why don't you write that down in front of you right now, and we'll capture that at the end of these lightning talks so that we're continuing to build shared knowledge and shared conversation with you. With that, Phil, you're on deck. I'm going to turn it over to you Just
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. I've been having some internet issues in my neighborhood, so if I freeze up, holler at me and I'll turn off and let it refresh there.
Sounds good.
Thanks everybody for having me here today. It's really exciting to be here, and I scrolled through and saw a lot of familiar faces here, a number of people who we've worked with restoration projects on in the past and lamented the lack of a more expedited process to kind of move those through state permitting. And so I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about an initiative that we're undertaking at the State Water Board to provide such a permit. And so for those of you who have worked on, and I'm Phil Crater, I'm Assistant Deputy with the State Water Board Division of Water Quality here in Sacramento. For those of you who have worked with the Water Board on restoration permitting in the past, you are probably aware that we have a small restoration permit that we've had available for some time. It's for smaller projects that have a footprint of less than 5 acres or a linear total of less than 500 linear feet of stream bank or coastline, and that qualify for a very specific CEQA exemption. And so for projects that meet those requirements, there is a fast pathway to get an approval for the water board permitting that you need for that type of a project. Unfortunately, that leaves a lot of bigger restoration projects off the table, and those are the kinds of projects that we really need to be investing in now. And so we've recognized for some time the need for a similar permit that would allow expedited permitting for these larger projects. But like many of the things that we want to do, we've lacked the resources to develop the permit and the supporting CEQA documentation. And so sometime back, Sustainable Conservation, who I see here today, approached us and offered to provide us support for developing an environmental document for such a permit. And we're super grateful for the support that they provided. We wouldn't be where we are today without what they've done. And so I cannot say enough how much I appreciate what they've contributed. So the purpose of this new order is really just to pick up where our small restoration order leaves off. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. This proposed order will provide a Clean Water Act 401 water quality certification, which is federal coverage, and state waste discharge requirement or state water quality permitting coverage in one permit for these restoration projects statewide, which means regardless of where a project is in the state, it's one set of requirements. All the projects that are covered have to meet the definition of a restoration project and comply with all of the applicable water quality control plans and state policies, et cetera. And so it's really trying to set an even playing field and a consistent set of rules, no matter where you are in the state. And this is important. I'll get into why it's important to help us get to an answer more quickly. So the first thing that a project needs to do is comply with a restoration project definition. And that's defined as a project that would result in a net increase in aquatic or riparian resource area functions and or services through implementation of a number of eligible project types, protection measures, which are like BMPs, and consideration of design guidelines. So there's a lot of criteria that we've laid out in the proposed permit that if you go through it and you meet the definition and do these things, then that qualifies you for entrance. And what we're trying to do is tell people up front, what do you need to do specifically in order to qualify for this permit? So an applicant can try and shape their project. They can work with us, with the regional water boards, with our partners at the Resources Agency to try and design something so that when they come to us for the approval, it's really easy for us to evaluate whether or not it qualifies for the permit. And if it does, to get to an answer quickly. And so if the eligibility requirements are not met, we have an opportunity to still issue an individual permit through the state water board or through a regional water board. But we're hoping to fit as many projects into this larger permit as we can. And so that gets kind of to our strategy here, which is, like always, we're trying to balance a permit that has a really broad scope, which carries some baggage of needing a much bigger environmental review. And it has, you know, the broader the scope, the harder it is to get the permit adopted, but then the easier it is to use the permit once it's adopted. So we talked with our stakeholders at the NGOs and the restoration community, other communities out there. We spoke with the regional water boards and our other agencies to figure out how do we strike that balance. And there's a current draft out that I'll get to where you all can find that if you haven't seen it yet, to make sure that you have an opportunity to take a look at it. But what we're trying to do really is get to a yes or a no more quickly. And of course, we want to permit as many restoration projects as we can. So I would love to say yes to everything, but we also need to acknowledge that some projects are just too big or too specific, that they don't fit into the proposed framework. And that doesn't mean that we need to say no to it. But what it means is that if it doesn't fit, it's easier for us to get to a no quickly on this draft permit and tell somebody you need to take a different approach. That way they don't spend a lot of time, their permit doesn't languish. They don't feel like they're playing bring me another rock. They feel like, okay, this isn't the right fit, so we're going to move over to this other permitting process. And of course, if they do fit, we have this thing set up so that we can issue an approval relatively quickly and get that out there. So we think it's just as useful to get to a no as a yes. We hope to get to yes more often, but we leave space for both. There's a number of eligible project types that include stream crossings, fish passage improvements, removal of small dams, tide gates, floodgates, bioengineered bank stabilization, water conservation projects, floodplain restoration, removal of pilings and other in-water structures, removal of non-native terrestrial aquatic species, etc. This is all up on our website, and I'm going to direct you to that so you have an opportunity to look at more detail. But in terms of where we're at, we made the doc available on June 30th, 2021. It's been out for a public review and comment. That ended August 13th. We're currently reviewing all those comments. We're going to see where we've missed things or where we need to get clarification and circle back with the public. The proposed order is anticipated to come back to our board for adoption in 2022. And once that happens, we would make it available to project applicants to use. So if you haven't already taken a look at the order, I don't know, Shawn, if there's a way for me to put the link up for people so that they can get in and look at it, but I'd like to make that available. And then I'll be around today if people have questions, and my contact info, I think, is in the meeting notes, so you can reach out to me as well. So I just also really quickly just wanted to say thanks, not just to Sustainable Conservation, but also to our partners at the regional boards, at Department of Fish and Wildlife, and at Department of Water Resources. They've all been really wonderful in working with us. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. So glad the internet cooperated with us and we were able to hear that. Really appreciate your words too. Just thinking about the opportunity that's been a long time coming, working with partnership over quite a long period of time to increase the pace and scale of the work that you're doing in the water permitting, water compliance arena. Really demonstrates, I think, how the principles of cutting green tape around regulatory effectiveness are really percolating in a lot of different corners. It also makes me think that lightning rounds also help contribute to the pace and scale of conversation. Like, we are moving quickly through a lot of information, and this is fantastic. So thanks so much, Phil, for jumping in.
Thank you.
In terms of dropping a link for folks, if you want to put that in the chat box, they'll have it immediately. Otherwise, we can follow up with folks afterward. And just a note too for Chad, if you're still on, that Peter dropped a question in the chat box that maybe you have a quick answer for, if you wouldn't mind dropping in there around the timeline for moving that RMP from pilot into a broader usage. All right, let's keep the lightning storm going here. Madeline, we're gonna invite you forward. And as Phil did, if you would start with just a few words about who you are and your day job, your affiliation, and then jump right in.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Madeline Cavalieri. I'm the Coastal Commission's statewide planning manager, and I'm happy to be here to report on some recent success we've had in our cutting green tape efforts along the coast. The cutting green tape recommendations called for the Coastal Commission to utilize efficiencies within its existing authority to advance small and large scale restoration, and Commission staff has been working towards that in a number of different ways. One is through the development of a series of public works plans. They're kind of like a programmatic permit for forest restoration and wildfire resilience projects. This past July, the Commission approved the first 2 plans for projects carried out in coordination with the RCDs of San Mateo and Santa Cruz counties. And together, the approved plans will allow for these restoration projects to be carried out over an almost 140,000 acre program area over a 10-year period without the need for additional coastal permits. And the projects can be carried out either by the RCDs themselves or in coordination with the RCD, which is responsible for implementing the process laid out in the plan. So the plans were approved after over a year of working group meetings with commission staff, RCD staff and their consultants, as well as CAL FIRE and state park staff. And I think there were 3 key components to the project's success that I wanted to share today. The first was multi-agency alignment. We were fortunate to have the foundation laid out in the California Vegetation Treatment Program, EIR, which had already established a great deal of alignment through the hard work of the Board of Forestry. For the coastal plan, we built on that existing framework, agreeing to use both the process and the substance of the protections that were established in the EIR, and we then continued to build agency alignment through our working group meetings. The second key component was respect and understanding for the mission and goals of each of the agencies involved, as well as the existing environmental protections that the project was subject to. So one of the central issues that we had to deal with was how to ensure the Coastal Act's strict protections for sensitive habitats could be carried out in the changing climate. And I think that will be an issue that will come up across the board in all types of restoration programs. The Commission understands that we can no longer restore ecosystems only to their historic condition, and instead we need to factor in anticipated changes and plan for a dynamic and ever-changing future condition. For this project, we came up with about a 2-page bulleted list of standards that we all felt needed to be met in order to comply with the Coastal Act requirements, and we built the project approval around those standards. So the third key component for success was an upfront investment of time and resources. Multi-agency alignment and programmatic authorizations are very time intensive, but they really pay dividends after plans are approved. Unfortunately, at the Coastal Commission, we're often required to choose between this kind of upfront investment and our day-to-day legal requirements. So looking to the future, this public works plan is a model that can be repeated for both forest health and other types of restoration throughout the coast. In October, the Commission will be acting on a forest health plan for San Luis Obispo County. We're also working on one with Monterey County, as well as working on a programmatic approval for the CDFW's Fisheries Restoration Grant Program. So in closing, I would just say that this public works plan has shown what we can do when we work together towards a common goal and with a sense of urgency and importance. And with additional staff capacity, we can build on this momentum to develop more programmatic approvals for restoration work along the coast. And again, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline. You guys are really doing an amazing job summarizing a lot of really exciting information in a really short space. So obviously it's some really cool stuff happening there on the coast, 140-acre project over 10 years. But just as important in my mind was all the work that went into that to bring partners together through meaningful conversation to really figure out how you could do it in a way that met everyone's needs and interests along the way. So what a fantastic story with a great outcome and very much exemplary of the kind of work that we hope continues to be proffered through the Cutting Green Tape initiative. So thanks so much for bringing that forward and good luck as you continue these efforts moving forward as well. And our last lightning strike here. I don't know why I keep thinking that's funny, but I do. Matt Clifford, good to see you. Welcome to the screen and take it away. If you would like to start by introducing yourself, that'd be great.
Sure will. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. So I'm Matt Clifford. I'm a staff attorney for Trout Unlimited's California Water Project. And I'm going to talk briefly here about a bill we sponsored in the current legislature, AB 315. And I'll start off by noting that AB 315 is currently on Governor Newsom's desk. And I promised everyone I would not jinx it by talking as though it were already law. But that said, we are very hopeful that it will soon become law. And I'll talk a bit about what it does. So AB 315, like so many aspects of cutting green tape, it addresses an impediment to restoration that arises from the risk of taking action. But in this case, it's a little bit of different context because the impediment we're talking about doesn't arise from permitting processes directly by agencies. Rather, it's from the perceived risk of tort liability. This is liability for personal injury or property damage that a landowner potentially takes on as the result of getting involved in a voluntary restoration project. Now, those of you who do project work will know that one of the questions that inevitably comes up when you sit down with a landowner to talk about a voluntary restoration project, sooner or later, they're going to look you in the eye and ask the question, can you guarantee me that if I agree to let this go forward to my property, if something goes wrong, that I won't be held liable? And kind of the classic case of this, is like if we have a project to put large wood, logs in streams for habitat, for example, and one of those logs come loose and gets washed downstream, ends up in someone's living room, kind of get sued for that. And the answer to that question, unfortunately, is no. We can't guarantee you that because that's not the way that tort liability works, right? So when a plaintiff would come along if someone's unfortunately injured by an accident for a project, they're going to name everybody involved in that project and let the court sort it out. What we can tell a landowner is that that's exceedingly unlikely to happen, that they would be found liable. And there's several reasons for that. For one thing, claims from restoration projects are really rare. In research for the bill, we've been able to find one that's ever happened in California. It just doesn't happen very often. If it does happen, the landowner is very unlikely to be held liable because if all they did was allow the project to go forward on their land, they really haven't done anything to give rise to liability. The folks that actually, folks like me who actually proposed a project and hired people to build it, and the contractors and the state, frankly, those are the folks who are going to get held liable. And we're all well insured, and there's a lot. But at the end of the day, we can't look that landowner in the eye and tell them that nothing, you can't ever get liability from this project. So even though we're dealing with what's clearly more of a perceived risk than an actual risk, that perception of risk has been enough to kill a number of fairly ambitious projects. And even where it doesn't kill a project entirely, it can cause them to be designed in a more conservative way that sometimes provide less environmental benefit than it could just because of that perception to control liability. So what really is needed here is someone to step in and basically say the buck stops here. We will take on this very small but real risk of liability, and for the reason that we think that restoration is an important enough goal that we're willing to take that on and be the payer of last resort. And the one party that can really do that is the state. And this is what AB 315 does. Well, it provides basically that a landowner who does no more than allow restoration to go forward on their property, they don't actually get involved in do any of the restoration, but they let project proponents and the agencies come in and do restoration. In that case, in the unlikely event that landowner ever becomes liable for damages for tort liability, the state in general will indemnify them for that liability. A few sideboards and caveats on that. For smaller projects, and so this is projects that apply for qualify for the CEQA small habitat restoration exemption, 5 acres or less generally. For those smaller projects, the state shall indemnify. No further action is needed. The state will indemnify a landowner for those. For larger projects, the state may indemnify on a case-by-case basis, and this allows the state to adjust the liability on a case-by-case basis and enter an agreement with the landowner. And this is consistent with cut and green tape principles, where you really want to focus the analysis on larger projects that have more going on, and really not getting hung up on these details of smaller projects that we need to do at scale. It applies AB 315 to riparian restoration only, and not to upland projects. And it applies to projects funded by certain named agencies, which are the familiar, like Natural Resources Agencies, CDFW, DWR, et cetera, that typically fund restoration. So I can say more if there are questions, but long story short, this bill passed through both houses on consent. I don't think there was any opposition to it at the end of the day. We are very grateful to Assemblymember Jim Stone, who sponsored the bill, to CDFW and the Resources Agency and the Water Board for helping us work through the language, and to our many partners among the NGO community and the RCDs and the private sector who supported the bill. And we are very hopeful that it will be signed, and we really look forward to we think so it'll allow some ambitious projects to go forward that are currently stalled. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. So I think you're starting to see how individual expertise and ability and partnership with others is helping fulfill some of the key messages and demonstrate how to move forward on some of the key principles of cutting green tape. I don't know that I would have, by nature been drawn into a conversation on landowner liability or indemnification, or if I can even say that word 5 times in a row. But you can see through the comments that Matt just made how important that is to this broader story of how do we do more? How do we increase the pace and scale of our work, especially as it relates to these beneficial restoration activities that we're now seeing start to accelerate across the state. So thanks for bringing that voice forward, Matt. We have now concluded the lightning storm, the lightning strike, and thanks again to those 4 individuals for sharing so much so quickly to really fill our minds with a lot of important updates and a lot of progress. You can imagine now that the lightning has passed and that we've got a nice calming rain in front of us, and that is an opportunity for Devin to bring another poll up onto the screen and invite you to a reflective mentality of, well, what really stood out to me as I was listening to those 4 individuals share their updates and their thoughts. Maybe you were part of one of those initiatives. Maybe you're benefiting from one of those activities. Maybe you're interested in learning more, but just be curious to hear from you for a second. What stood out? Could be a word, a phrase, progress, multi-agency focus on cutting the green tape. Awesome. Optimism, right? Heard a lot of hope that we're making progress and things are really moving forward in a beneficial way in a short period of time too, right? Not just the pace of our presentations today, but the pace of work has seemed to really accelerate. Collaboration and partnerships and how important it is that we do this together and we're learning from each other. Concrete progress, excited about the reduction in processing time. Yeah, that whole piece on reducing liability for landowners that Matt just shared. Good to see some real movement on that. A lot of earnestness and care, the collaboration, the general order, I love that, brings new meaning to those 2 words, right? Optimism and opportunity. Sustainable conservation is right. There are every voice is really contributing to this. We've got some great partners, great collaboration, great commitment, great learning, great thinking about what's possible, but also how do we do it with care and intention and really thinking about the resource in our communities. Resources are being allocated too, right? This isn't just ideas. We're putting dollars behind these to support them moving forward. Leadership support is there. Relevant stuff is getting done. Agencies are there. They're willing, they're able, they're leading the charge in many places. Programmatic permitting, upfront planning. Great. Let's just let this scroll for another minute or so and just thank all of you for bringing your thoughts and your voice into it. Yeah, creativity. Haven't seen that one necessarily come forward yet, but certainly something Jen highlighted early in our conversation today. Moving away from restoring to historic conditions. Urgency, streamlining applications. Great. I think you guys can probably read as well as I can. I just get excited and start to articulate what I'm seeing show up on the screen. Willingness to try. I think that's so important now. We're facing unprecedented change. The climate crisis that Wade highlighted at the beginning of our conversation today is just really forcing us to do things differently and really think about what can we do? How can we lean on our diversity of interests and abilities and areas of expertise and creativity to make those things happen? And it's through these partnerships and through cooperation and setting the stage for more progress. Awesome. So Devin, why don't we stop there? We'll make sure to provide everyone with a summary of what's coming through in these polls and the report out. And with that, a bit of a transition, but still in many ways, hearing from all of you in the listening audience about what's on your mind. One of the things that we had the chance to do before this particular meeting was just reach out to all of you and really with that thought of curiosity in mind. What are you working on? What are you thinking about? What do you think the opportunity is with cutting green tape as we continue to move forward? And so thank you for sharing those responses. Shalana, welcome to the screen. You've done the hard work of reviewing those and distilling those. And I think you're prepared to share some high-level thoughts back with us just now. So please introduce yourself and then let us know what you found out.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shalana Da Silva. I'm a steering committee member of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. It's really wonderful to see all of you here today. As Shawn mentioned, I'm going to be giving you a few updates about some responses that we got from the survey. So in registering for this exchange meeting, we asked all of you to respond to a short survey. Basically, the California Landscape Stewardship Network collects this kind of information so that we can understand directly from practitioners and stakeholders like yourselves what's working, what's of interest, and where the challenges remain in the realm of cutting green tape. We'd like to share your responses with the cutting green tape leaders at state agency level, including Deputy Secretary Jen Norris at the California Natural Resources Agency. And these comments help inform future exchange agendas, and they support our shared learning on cutting green tape priorities. So with that, I'll share just a few highlights now, and I just want to thank everyone for your thoughtful and creative responses. So the bright spots, there was a lot of commentary about the momentum, and we saw that in the Poll Everywhere responses we just did together. There's a lot of energy to collaborate at scale in a new way, and a lot of the comments were around that there's a realized shared understanding of the urgency that we face today with the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. We're seeing more funding. We just passed a historic budget. Governor Newsom signed this recently with a climate resilience package of $3.7 billion, so that's huge. Folks also noted that they're seeing a lot more interagency collaboration. And we're also seeing new environmental justice and tribal liaison leadership positions being filled in our state government, and that was really exciting to folks as well. And of course, we heard a little bit about this in our lightning talks. There are a number of new tools in the regulatory and permitting toolbox that people are excited about. The general order, the CEQA statutory exemption, and things like this are all sort of examples of sort of new pathways that are being forged under the cutting green tape rubric. Devin, if I can ask you to hit that spacebar, please. So some of the challenges that folks commented about, there are ongoing permitting and regulatory challenges that are cumbersome, costly, and have lengthy timelines, as we know. Some of the comments were around securing CSA coverage, dealing with city or county level permits and fees, or having to compromise on multi-benefit approaches for projects because of the permitting complexities. Other challenges including the existing culture of risk aversion. So despite all of the progress that we're making together, we do see that there is still this culture of risk aversion that persists. And so that was one challenge that was articulated a few times in some of your responses. And then, of course, there are ecological or location-specific challenges that practitioners face in permitting their projects. Some of this could be permitting for projects in the coastal zone, working at the watershed scale, or working on cross-jurisdictional approaches to restoration. And then, of course, there's what seems like an evergreen problem that I hope we can solve, which is aligning the short window of grant funding with the time that it takes to get all your permits in order. All right, Devin, you hit the spacebar again for me, please. Thanks so much. So what do we need going forward? There was a lot of commentary around needing guidance on the use of some of the new tools that are being created, and some sort of general questions about how cutting green tape applies to people's projects on the ground. It was also noted that folks feel that it's really important for us to be doing this work collectively, advocating for cutting green tape priorities in Sacramento, but there is still an opportunity to educate and support local and regional staff in being bold and innovating around permitting efficiencies. So that issue of working with local agency staff and regional agency staff on the ground was another that was identified as really important. And then learning how to work with California tribes and supporting their leadership and stewardship and restoration actions was another issue that came up in some of these comments. And then finally, I think another theme that really rose to the top as we kind of looked at people's responses was, how can cutting green tape apply for projects that have federal jurisdiction? So we're really going to be looking at that too as well, thinking about how we can work on projects at the federal level or cross-jurisdictional projects that involve federal partners, and how to bring some of the principles and rubric of cutting green tape to that work as well. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for your thoughtful considerations and comments in those survey responses. And we look forward to bringing a lot of that data and your good questions into upcoming meetings.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shalana, for not just asking the question, but really reviewing those responses with so much care and putting those into those different categories and being able to speak so clearly about what you saw and what we heard from those responses. And I like those categories, the bright spots. Those are the things that we're really seeing progress on, and the lightning talks continue to validate and support those. There are challenges that remain though. So let's make sure that we're not turning a blind eye to those, keep those challenges coming forward too, so that we can learn about where they are, what they are, and how we can incorporate some creative problem solving to address those challenges. And then what's next? We know that we're part of an ongoing shared journey here. There's still a lot in front of us. Where are those places where we really have an opportunity to expand our thinking and to make a real difference? And so those categories to me really stood out. So thanks for framing that up and sharing the voices of our participants with everyone. All right, on to our next transition here. Our next feature on the program is what we're calling a moderated Q&A. And I gave a little bit of a preview earlier saying that maybe this replicates a little bit of that talk show host dynamic. And what it does more than anything is give you a little bit of a break from hearing from me. And so we have moderators set up here for two major topics. The first one's coming on the screen now, and I see Devin is getting a slide up in front of us. It looks like, there we go. So we've got a moderator and a couple of participants, panelists here, and these may be familiar faces to many of you, but Darcy, thanks so much for stepping forward to help moderate this panel discussion on forest health and fire management, and for Jessica Morris and Patrick Wright for being there to engage in a conversation with each other around some of the key issues and challenges and questions that are coming forward as we think about forest health and fire management in the context of the changing conditions and urgent needs that we have across the landscape. The format for these is we'll hear from them first, about 7 or 9 minutes of conversation, and then we're going to be able to reach out to you with some questions that the panelists are actually curious about or want to learn more from you. And then we're going to switch to this conversation on multi-benefit project permitting. Kellex Nelson and Chris Turnell are going to engage in conversation on that topic and really explore some of the dimensions of systems thinking that are inherent in many of the conversations we're having around cutting green tape. So with that, I want to introduce our first group here to the front of the room. And I think, Devin, you're working the magic behind the scenes there to bring forward Darcy, Jessica, and Patrick. There we are, except I'm not Patrick.
Thank you, Shawn. As Patrick's coming up on the screen, I just want to relay my enthusiasm for being able to chat with my friends and colleagues, Patrick and Jessica, on this important and very timely conversation. Not only a statewide issue, fire resiliency and forest management, but something that's near and dear recently to my heart and Patrick's as well, and Jessica. We're all in the vicinity of the Caldor fire that is still burning, but thankfully not threatening any of our homes. I was evacuated from my home for a little over 2.5 weeks, and I know Jessica had some evacuees at her home, and Patrick was watching us across the lake. And I really think and can say with some certainty that the work that we have done in the Lake Tahoe Basin to focus on forest and fuels management and to start to prepare ourselves for catastrophic wildfires was instrumental in helping save our community. Although some of the surrounding areas weren't as lucky as we were, we didn't lose a single home in Lake Tahoe. And that's substantial and exciting. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And I'm excited to hear about some of the things that we are learning and that we're going to be doing to manage our forests in different regions in the near future. So with that, I'm gonna start with you, Patrick, and I would love to hear about the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force plan that you've successfully completed and starting to execute. And maybe you can just give all of the listeners a little insight into that plan and some information on what has come up since you've completed it.
Sure. Hopefully, yes, I'm off mute. Thank you. Yes, I'm director of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. We pulled together a comprehensive action plan, as Darcy suggested, in January, together with the state's budget, to really try to pull together based on previous recommendations from task force work groups, from LAO, from the legislature, from a joint stewardship agreement between the Forest Service and CNRA, trying to pull all that together into a comprehensive statewide plan that connects the dots between what CAL FIRE is doing, CNRA, Cal EPA, OPR, basically everything that's happening in the state that's forest and wildfire resilience oriented, so it would be in one place and sort of point the way forward so that this incredible array of dozens of different agencies can be working together through a common framework. So we pulled that together in January. It is just a framework. The hard work is really to try to make it real, to develop both a series of statewide strategies. We're building a so-called 1,000,000 acre strategy, both through a series of executive orders on the state side, where governors have said the state side is going to ramp up to treat 500,000 acres annually. Through the stewardship agreement, we now have the Forest Service agreeing to that as well. So we're building a 1 million acre strategy to try to ramp up the pace and scale of work. We're doing that through a combination of both statewide specific strategies, a statewide reforestation strategy to hit our highest priority areas based on the recent fires, a statewide prescribed fire plan to ramp up prescribed fire, et cetera, and other statewide workforce and wood utilization strategies. But more and more every day, we're beginning to turn to regional frameworks to try to get work done. The Secretary and others have really embraced this concept, particularly through the Department of Conservation's Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, where regional frameworks are growing and expanding throughout the state of California. So increasingly, we're going to be working at 3 different regional levels. One is, we call it sort of the Big 4 level, which is the North Coast, the Sierra Nevada, the Central Coast, and Southern California. So we're developing a series of regional profiles for each of those 4 areas, recognizing that each of those have different priorities and risks that need to be addressed. The second level is the RFFC level, where we're likely to have 15 to 20 regional frameworks throughout the state that integrate forest health, watershed management, wildlife, as many different attributes of natural resources as possible, climate adaptation. The idea over time is to shift more and more from competitive grants to block grants to those regional areas. So that's an ongoing effort that you can look to, and a lot of the folks on line today will certainly be actively involved in shaping your respective regional frameworks in your particular area. And then the third level down is the collaborative level. That's the RCD level. In the Tahoe Sierra area, there's Lake Tahoe West, North Yuba, South Fork American River. There's these series of collaboratives up and down the state. They're doing watershed work and forestry work. So the relevance to this group is we're now having a very active, lively conversation about what level of analysis is appropriate at each of those 3 levels. Clearly at the Big 4 level, we're going to keep it really simple with profiles, but the big challenge is at this RFFC level, at the regional level, can we develop these regional frameworks in ways that help streamline things at the collaborative level? So as an example, the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, which I launched a couple of years ago with the Forest Service, is looking at the whole 2.4 million acre area between roughly 50 and 80 in Sacramento and Tahoe. And the idea is, if we can work at that level is big enough to deal with things like wood utilization strategies, where are you going to put all the wood that comes off the forest, climate adaptation strategies, workforce strategies, et cetera. So the idea is to create these big regional frameworks that will allow the collaboratives to go faster. Because what's happening across the state and across the country is that collaboratives are being set with 2 opposite forces. One force says, go fast, increase pace and scale. And then this other force is saying, slow down, be collaborative, make sure everybody's on board. Collaborative processes are messy. Often collaboratives can take a year or 2 or 3 just to reach agreement on goals or desired conditions. So the idea is to use these regional frameworks to try to accelerate that work. So a key issue of this group geographically is what level of analysis, particularly at that regional level, is appropriate to help streamline things at the local level. So that's something that we'll be discussing over the next several months. The second issue, which is related, is the time period. Increasingly, whether it's cap and trade money or other money, we're looking at projects and plans that are no longer talking about results in 3 to 5 years, but over 30 to 50 years when dealing with climate. So how do the state CEQA, NEPA, and permitting processes adjust or balance the need for short-term protection versus long-term protection? As I was talking to Darcy, some of the issues we've had in Tahoe and other areas where Upper Truckee River restoration is a good example, where that's the biggest tributary that leads into Lake Tahoe. We came up with at the Conservancy this comprehensive restoration plan that would dramatically reduce fine sediment loadings to the lake, but it had a short-term spike in fine sediment. How do you deal with that? We had to spend millions and millions of dollars to avoid that short-term spike to deal with the regulatory process, even though the long-term benefits were 10 times greater than that. but the regulatory process didn't allow us in any way to adjust or to trade off short-term with long-term. And I've heard from folks throughout the state that that can be an impediment in even doing projects, overcoming the need to deal with short-term impacts. So again, you've got geography at different scales, you've got time periods at different scales. And then the third element, which makes it even more complicated, is the scope. Over time, what we want these regional frameworks to be are not just forest plans. What we don't want in California are regional forest plans, regional wildlife plans, regional climate adaptation plans, regional water plans, all on top of each other. So the idea is over time to make these increasingly integrated natural resources plans, but that increases the complexity enormously with respect to permitting, with respect to buy-in, with respect to CEQA and NEPA. So we're simultaneously trying to deal with all of those three tensions: the geographic scale, what's important, the time frame, what's the right balance between short-term and long-term, and then what's the right balance between a focused effort on fire and biodiversity versus also integrating wildlife, climate, recreation, et cetera. So all of these are big challenges that we're dealing with as we're trying to move these regional frameworks forward. And certainly we'll be working very closely with the agencies that have been on the phone today to try to figure out how our various CEQA, NEPA, and regulatory processes balance these competing issues that are at stake.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to shift it over to Jessica to talk about the California Vegetation Treatment Program. And if we have time, I'd love to come back to you, Patrick, and explore a little bit about the lessons that you learned in your previous role as Executive Director for the Tahoe Conservancy with Tahoe West and how that might have informed this task force and your work there. So think about that while we turn to Jessica. And let's hear a little bit about the Vegetation Treatment Program. What is it yielding? How do you see it evolving? Where are the successes and challenges?
Thanks, Darcy. And before we dive into the CalVTP, I just wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of the budget for forest and wildfire resilience that was just signed by the governor. We went from a $75 million budget for forest and wildfire resilience last year to $1.5 billion this year. We had $500 million were in early action and $1 billion just signed by the governor last week. So that's going to be a huge surge across all those fronts that Patrick was talking about. We had $110 million for the regional forest and fire capacity program to develop and get that staffing and planning dollars down to those regional collaboratives. We have a specific program for funding state parks, specific program for investing in science and spatial analytics, specific program for wood utilization to jumpstart industries around there. So I think a lot of you have been involved in those conversations, but if you haven't been, I'm really happy to do a deep dive with all of you on what's in the budget at a later date. So just want to flag that, but this is a really critical game changer for this entire sector, and we're seeing results. But another big game changer that did get funding in the budget so can fully materialize is the California Vegetation Treatment Program Environmental Impact Review. As many of you may recall, this was a 20 million acre pre-analysis across the non-federal high fire risk landscape in California. So basically any land that we're going to do a fuel reduction or fire resilience project on that would require CEQA. And so we did this pre-analysis. It took years, but it was approved last year. And what was really smart about this approach is that it was a multi-agency effort. So the Coastal Conservancy, state water boards, Department of Fish and Wildlife integrated their permitting standards into the mitigation steps that are required in the CalVTP. So the CalVTP takes your CEQA process for fuel reduction and fire resilience projects from 2 years down to about 2 months. And it requires you just to do a boots on the ground analysis and then follow mitigating steps for the habitats that are required. Department of Fish and Wildlife fully integrated all of their mitigation steps for their permits that could potentially be triggered by typical fuel reduction projects into the process. So basically you actually can't trigger by following these mitigation steps like a species take permit, for example. And so those mitigations are built in, so your fish and wildlife and your CEQA are covered. Then the state water boards came up with a really innovative approach where they established the statewide permit that is automatic enrollment through the CalVTP. So because all of their mitigations were already fully integrated through the CalVTP, they came up with a statewide permit. And so basically the CalVTP now gets you in one application, one environmental analysis, and one 2-month process. It gets you your CEQA, it gets you your Fish and Wildlife, and it gets you your water board permits. And so it's a 3-for-1 environmental review process. Now, what's also helpful is that in this budget, we invested funding into the Board of Forestry to do a lot of the project specific analysis. So the VTP analysis that would be required on projects throughout the state. So we're essentially using real projects as templates so that we have VTP analysis done on different vegetation types and landscape types and land ownership types throughout the state. Because the Cal VTP is a 1,000-page document. So we don't want you guys to have to try to reinvent the wheel, interpret it on your own. So we're hiring the authors of the VTP to essentially do 30 to 40 site-specific analyses that can be then used as templates throughout the state. And those will be done on state-funded projects. So if you're a state grantee, have a project that requires your CEQA analysis for fuel reduction, flag that for us, and we can see if it meets any of the needs to be able to get the state covered in templates for the different geographies and vegetation types we're looking for. So that's going to be a really fast path. Again, it's the first time we have a 3-for-1 CEQA analysis. It maintains substantive environmental review without the lengthy timeline or the additional costs.
Great. And the VTP has been on the street for a while, and you have a captive audience here of over 140 practitioners and supporters. Maybe it's a good opportunity to hear from them. Devin, do you want to put that poll in the chat box? And let's hear a little bit about who's been using the plan, if there's any feedback. This could be informative for Jessica and her team. Have you used the plan? Or are you planning to use it? So of the respondents, and maybe we can dissect these numbers a little bit because this is going to depend on how many people are responding, but of our viewers, it seems like somewhere around 30% have used it. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and it's pretty new on the street. I mean, it's been technically approved for about a year, but I mean, it's really just rolling out. Yeah, the water board's integration was just this a couple months ago. So a lot of this is pretty new still. So this is exciting.
Okay, do we have a second question that's relevant? So Jessica, you mentioned that you're working on a template. I'm curious to see if more people would be likely to use it if there was a template. Well, if that was just one person who said yes, that one person very excited to use the template. That's good to know. And I think there's one more, might be one more question in there.
We've got a question.
Okay, this one is more relevant for Patrick. Well, since it's up there, Patrick, you might want to just give a little background because this is something you and I talked about. With the action plan, you were mentioning the difficulties with the large landscape scale and long time scales of this plan.
Sure, and some of our speakers talked about that earlier. Some of the agency processes, it used to be that all of the emphasis on streamlining was for small projects, less than 5 acres. And so it's great to hear the State Water Board and others are thinking bigger. In fact, when we started the Lake Tahoe West project, we asked our consultants, give us a plan for streamlining the regulatory approach to this. And their initial answer was, take advantage of all these exemptions for small projects. And we said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to go big. but the system hasn't been set up to go big in a streamlined way. So I think between CalVTP and some of the work that the Water Board and Fish and Wildlife are doing, we're getting there. We're getting to regulatory and planning rules that allow us to think on much bigger scales. The work isn't still done, but I'm encouraged by the progress that we're making.
You could keep typing your answers into this polling, because I will pass it along to Patrick, and I think it could be very informative. Or you can put them in the chat box, as we'll coordinate those later. In the last couple of minutes, I'm going to come back to you, Patrick, with the question I had earlier. I'm curious how your work with Tahoe West, since you were instrumental in that process, how it might have informed your work on the task force and the ultimate plan that came out of that working group.
Sure, I would say two things, couple of anecdotes. The first thing we did, and for those of you that don't know about Lake Tahoe West, it's a 60,000 acre landscape scale project on the west shore of Lake Tahoe. What makes it unique is the ownership pattern. You're dealing with state parks land, Forest Service land, Conservancy land, and private land, Homewood Ski Area, and others. So the challenge is, how do you come up with a restoration plan that crosses all those ownerships? The first thing that the regional supervisor from the Forest Service and I did with TRPA is we met with staff and we said, do not self-censor. Tell us what you want this landscape to look like. As I'm sure most of you know on the phone, and I'm guilty of this too as a recovering regulator, you tend to factor in your plan what you previously consider is achievable or doable under the regs. So as an example, in this case, everybody knows in Tahoe, you don't go near steep slopes and you don't go near stream zones. The leadership said, ignore all that. Tell us what you want the landscape to look like. Let us, as TRPA, the Forest Service, the Conservancy, figure out ways of changing the rules to meet the strategy rather than having the strategy follow the rules. And we've done that, and TRPA and other agencies are moving to loosen restrictions in stream zones and steep slopes. So that's been a tremendous success. The harder part, and they're facing this right now, and I used to joke when we started this process, the easy part was to get the stakeholders on board with the vision. The hardest part is going to be to align the agency processes and procedures, because state parks, the Conservancy, and the Forest Service all go through different planning and regulatory processes. So even if they have an agreement on what they want the landscape to look like, they have different processes. And so those agencies right now, as we speak, are struggling on how to align that. For example, the Forest Service under the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act has an exemption for any project that's less than 10,000 acres. That's great, but then it leaves state parks and the Conservancy still to comply with CEQA. And even though there are lots of streamlining processes out there that we've talked about today, they're not completely aligned. And so the agency leadership right now is struggling with how do you align CEQA, NEPA, and permitting among state, federal, and private activities. It's a real challenge. I'm optimistic we'll get there, but it is a sign for the rest of the state that as we start to go landscape scale, crossing ownerships, it's going to take a lot of work to align the regulatory and planning processes of the federal, state, and local agencies.
Okay, in our last remaining minutes, I'm going to end it with you, Jessica, and just see if you have any thoughts about where the VTP might be evolving. Do you have, in the next year, you're hoping to add these components or integrate anything that Patrick was chatting about? And just wanted to say thanks for everyone who's continuing to write comments in the polling. It's going to be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we really do want it to become sort of a solid anchor for our fuel reduction and wildfire resilience projects on the landscape. We want people to have a comfort level with it. There's been a lot of trainings held on it already. We'd encourage you to take a look at those on the Board of Forestry site and just get comfortable with it. And that it is going to, part of the other reason we're trying to do those templates is so that there's a more or less a litigation-proof foundation for it, so that people aren't going to be afraid that they're using this process and then making themselves vulnerable to litigation. But there are some really, big additional steps. I think Kellex and Madeline were really highlighting how the Coastal Conservancy had taken the CalVTP and used it as a foundation to create a complementary process. We'd love in the future statewide to actually just say, hey, look, the VTP already integrates all of these mitigation steps. And so create a process so that the VTP can be sort of that application like the water boards did. I think the water boards asked a really solid question, which is what additional steps what additional environmental protections does additional paperwork add? And if the answer was none, then let's figure out a way to cut that paperwork down so that what we're really doing with our environmental oversight is adding environmental protections. Another area that we're really exploring is that sort of complement to the NEPA process, that how can we again make this NEPA CEQA crosswalk more streamlined, more straightforward, and get people just really comfortable using the CalVTP as a foundational tool to be able to create a very straightforward, safe, and streamlined path. Because I think part of it is regulatory reform, but part of it is just reforming our own sort of internal processes and cultures so that we're comfortable using some of the legal tools that we now have available.
Well, it seems like a good example of streamlining and cutting the green tape. Well, I thank you both for joining us. It's a good conversation. I look forward to culminating all of those responses and continuing this conversation offline. Back to you.
Thank you, Darcy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Darcy, Jessica, Patrick. Fantastic conversation. Thanks for all the engagement online too. Really good stuff happening in that conversation. I love that framework that Patrick introduced us to, thinking at those different scales, thinking about what level of analysis at each level is necessary, how we think about things like alignment across all of those, and how do we integrate the diversity of efforts that are out there. It makes me also think about a comment that was posted in the chat. So another way we're engaging in real time with you all is just that we can learn and integrate a lot of the work that's happening with tribal partners across the state too. And so Marissa's comment about making sure that we integrate current tribal plans and ecological knowledge, a really critical piece of these conversations as we move forward and think about how do we really stitch these together, weave them together in a way that achieves outcomes at scale and at a pace that really responds to the urgent needs. And then Jessica reflecting not just on game-changing investments in the budget that are going to provide new resources out on the ground, but how new tools like the VTP are helping advance those conversations too. And then a really important note just about how, even though we have these new tools, it's going to take some time. And so just some socialization around how do we actually integrate these into our work, into our thinking, and into the culture of our organizations and agencies. So fantastic conversation. Thanks again, guys. We're turning now to our next conversation. And I think the lesson learned from the first one is it's best done when I step out of the way. So Kellex and Chris, I'm just going to invite you to the screen here and turn it over to you to have a broader ranging conversation around how do we really think about all the multiple benefits that we're able to access when we bring these conversations together and think across resource areas. Kellex and Chris, there you are. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Kellex. Hey, everyone.
Good to see you. This has been quite the meaty conversation today. I hope we can contribute something as well, because I've been taking notes like wild. So for those who aren't familiar with Chris Turnell, I think you saw on the slide before, he is the Deputy Director of Integrated Watershed Management at the California Department of Water Resources. And my day job is as the Executive Director of the RCD in San Mateo County, and I lead the Regulatory Efficiencies Working Group of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. So good to see you, sort of. Well, I do see you, but I'm not with you. Let me just ask, the first thing I just want to dive in, Chris, and ask you about is I've heard you speak about how complex projects at scale are by definition multi-benefit. And you've spoken passionately about how we need to change the way that we talk about multi-benefit projects, the language that we use. And this has come up in the permitting context. So can you elaborate on that for this full group?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Kellex, and thanks everyone for having me here to share some thoughts. I just have to start out by saying that it's a real pleasure taking part in these Cutting the Green Tape Initiative discussions and pretty much anything related to the California Landscape Stewardship Network. It is such an amazing prompt to do the type of thinking that I wish I could set more time aside for. These conversations are super, super valuable. They're completely unique. in my experience across the governmental types of conversations, and they're absolutely necessary. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So, first of all, what I want to say is that I want to acknowledge that the conversations around multi-benefits in California and really beyond California, and what that means and what it means to get that word really baked into the lexicon of restoration ecology and practices, has been around for a long time. Multiple decades at least. This term multi-benefit has been thrown around and has really evolved in its own right. And I just want to acknowledge that there has been some tremendous, and there continues to be really tremendous work to really define what that means, and again, get it really built into the language of restoration practice, and also other water sector, for example, in my world is water sector pieces like flood management. For the purposes of the Central Valley, multi-benefit, for all intents and purposes, is broadly, just widely acknowledged and known to mean a flood project that also advances significant and meaningful natural processes or ecosystem restoration or something else along those lines that contribute to species restoration. That's a huge value to the conversation. It means that we don't always have to be redefining what we mean when we talk about these types of projects. But what I do want to say, in a way, thinking as objectively as I can about the current situation, honoring the past conversations around how we got to where we were on multi-benefit terminology and meaning and having it baked into projects and whatnot. But also looking ahead, I do see some vulnerabilities, Kellex, and everyone else, to the way that we, I think, can sometimes revert to talking about multi-benefit projects. And that's as if you have a single project that has at least two distinct public values, say flood management and public access, or flood management and ecosystem restoration. And to the extent that we can do that, that's a really great thing. From the proponent's perspective, it sometimes means you can access more money. It certainly is good at building, as you've really helped teach me, Kellex, and others on this phone call, that building community empowerment and engagement in a process, or in a project rather, and buy-in in that project, and how much more success that can lead to. So super important. But I think it's also a vulnerability to the extent that we talk about those values as being distinct and in a way severable within that project. And I think that it's a little bit of a disservice, or a little bit of a vulnerability rather, because I think that what I'm hearing is that in some cases, and I think Kellex, you might have some examples of this, from a regulatory agency perspective, to the extent that a project has a benefit other than simply ecosystem solely, and most projects do, if we think critically and creatively enough about all the projects that we all work on, they're pretty much all multi-benefit projects to some degree. Could that be seen as some sort of a Trojan horse from the perspective of a regulatory agency? Are you trying to actually advance a flood management project by calling it an ecosystem restoration multi-benefit project? Now, of course, that's not what's happening, but I think it's a potential vulnerability that we need to talk about as a community. And secondly, and maybe most importantly, I think of the vulnerability being one of, are we thinking hard enough about how we think about and design the types of projects that we're doing? Are we just at some point stapling together multiple benefits into a project? And I hate to use such like reductionist ways of talking about project development. I know that also doesn't happen. Just sort of for this conversation, what does it mean to move beyond trying to package together individual public benefits into something that we feel like could pass a threshold test of being acceptable to a funding agency or being acceptable to a community? Are we really pushing ourselves far enough? And one example of, I want to give two examples of where I see this changing. One is the Department of Water Resources, where I work, just entered into an MOU with a part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers R&D shop called Engineering with Nature. First of all, just think about that name, Engineering with Nature. And also remember that this is an Army Corps of Engineers accepted program that's making more and more headway every year that they're around within that, really the definition of large federal bureaucratic entity. So, excuse me. So a lot of what they focus on is exactly what's in their title. Not necessarily saying, how do we achieve our engineering objectives in this project using traditional engineering approaches, and how do we then achieve also some project value related to ecosystems using traditional nature-based solutions, but how do we actually achieve our engineering objectives using the power of Mother Nature? So whether it's about injecting sediment into a river to essentially literally build a downstream emergent berm within a river system in Mississippi, for example, using the power of the basics of hydrogeomorphology to advance that engineering objective, and in doing so, putting sediment back into a sediment-starved system. Just one example, but really brilliant stuff. So again, really starting to merge the benefits so that they are more synergistic and symbiotic, if you want to use a more of an ecological term, than simply sort of coexistent. That's really interesting to me, super valuable. The second one is, and it gets really back to language here, is that we're in charge of updating the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan every 5 years. And we've talked a lot, of course, about in the past, climate change is coming, climate change is here, climate change has huge impacts. So what do we do within the confines of the traditional flood management system to address that? Missing an opportunity, and we can't get away with that for the purposes of the 2022 plan update that we're about to put out in a couple of years, next year apparently. So I think we as implementers and regulatory agencies too, and we as like a restoration community can really look at climate change as being not just a unifying problem, but a unifying and organizing principle, if you will, for how we talk about this. And so one of the things we're going to be doing in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is moving in the direction of saying, look, climate change doesn't affect the flood system. It doesn't affect the groundwater system. It doesn't affect the riverine ecosystems. It doesn't affect the rim dams or the meadows above the rim dams. It affects hydrology. And hydrology impacts, changes in hydrology rather, we can talk about and quantify the impacts of that on all those different systems. And so therefore, by definition, the solutions that we come up with, articulated in the plan or actually just built on the ground, that's really the big goal, right? Of course, building actual projects, have built into them, again, by definition, to repeat that phrase, solutions that draw upon other aspects of the water management cycle and system, not just from flood protection. So I can start drawing clear desire and demand from a both ecological and engineering perspective for flood management purposes, really thinking through the traditional lens of flood values. I can make a much better line of an argument to upstream meadow restoration. I can make a better argument for reservoir reoperation, in-stream flows for fish, flood managed aquifer recharge, FloodMAR, the thing we're all hearing about a lot these days, that our organization is doing a lot to advance with a lot of you all out there. Moving floodwaters onto the floodplains to seep into the groundwater systems. That benefits those implementing SGMA, and on and on and on. So again, I'll just stop there because I'm probably going a little bit long, but it's that type of way of thinking about not just how we have cooler or more complicated projects that do more, but really taking a critical look at the language we use and to take an objective look at, is that self-limiting? What are the vulnerabilities of using those types of words when we describe what we're trying to achieve? And if we were to think a little bit differently about that, does it open up a new kind of horizon, if you will, for project development and planning? So that's super exciting to me, and appreciate the question.
So, I'm reflecting on the fact that in this conversation and in previous conversations or panels that I've seen you on, there's this sort of personal, emotional trust element that keeps bubbling up. Like, we're human in whatever organization we're participating in. There's something about our own values, beliefs, trust that we bring to this. Is this a Trojan horse? Is this really going to pave the way to this bad thing happening? Is a developer really going to build a condo on a wetland and put native plants around the parking lot and call it restoration? These are the kinds of things that come up. So let me just ask, from your perspective and what you're seeing, where are we with trusting nature-based solutions to some of the really pressing issues that we face?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've made huge progress. And I see a lot more trust being built between project implementers and the regulatory communities. And it's not just them, of course, but also local interests, local communities, agricultural economies that are oftentimes adjacent to are actually literally overlapping with these restoration objectives or these multi-benefit objectives. So I see a lot of trust being built between those communities, but I do have to say that, again, a lot of it comes back to personal responsibility. I know we might touch on this topic a little bit later in the conversation, but on the personal responsibility side, we really have to, and I really have to remember that simply because I'm representative of the big state with these, really important and big and sometimes lofty, but we have to get them done objectives, that there's a lot of considerations, there's a lot of feelings at the local level, regulatory agency level, implementing agency level, that need to be taken into consideration. And that communication, I know this is sort of a trope, especially with this group. I don't have to tell this to anybody on this phone call, but basic communication early in project development, hugely important for success, and that builds trust. I will also say lastly, just really quickly, that sometimes when we advance a lot of these conversations around regulatory challenges and what is it to be a multi-benefit project and how do we do more comes from the fact that we are doing a certain number of projects at any given time. Generally, I think we would all agree on this phone call, not enough projects. And so to the extent that you have a problem arise with an individual project, it's going to be a huge deal. And it is. It's important to look at what is the challenge, what is the regulatory challenge, what needs to happen, what's in the way. Am I in the way? Is this person in the way? Are we both in the way? How do we solve that? But to the extent that we are also doing more projects, and I think that it was mentioned, Jessica mentioned this last round, with all the new budget funding available, we have the ability to move more projects at once. And that means more opportunities to build that trust.
If we had more time and maybe in a future conversation, I'd like to drill down with you more on the bridge between, these concepts and the operational elements of it, how that happens with, a specific permit or with limited, constrained resources or timelines. And I know that Deputy Secretary Norris is going to come back on the line here in a couple minutes. So let me just ask you maybe 2 quick questions, and you can see how you want to answer them with the time that we have. Well, this isn't really a quick one. This is a big one about what you think needs to be done for Californians to accomplish restoration at the pace and scale sufficient to address our climate and biodiversity crises. And maybe in there, if you can note, I know that you've seen multi-benefit projects work at scale with NOAA for fisheries restoration, and anything that you think we can learn from that.
Yeah, I'll start with that last one quickly. We were able to take advantage for a big project, a 3,000+ acre project that we're doing with a firm called Ecosystem Investment Partners in the California Delta called Lookout Slough. And we were able to take advantage of NOAA's relatively new programmatic permit for Central Valley restoration for the purposes of moving that project along. And that is very much a multi-benefit project, and they had no issue with the fact that it also happened to provide significant flood benefits for that region. They were really able to see through any of that fog to, oh, this is a tremendously important ecological restoration project. We see that as an eligible beneficiary of our effort. So I think that was actually one of the first projects that made use of that permit, and that's so consistent with so much of what this Cutting Green Tape Initiative group does. So I just want to let you know that even at that scale, and we're not alone in that scale, but even at that scale, really good early successes are happening. To your first question, and Calix, I should ask, how much time do we have for that?
I think, well, let me ask Shawn. Shawn, what do you think? Do we have just 2 minutes left about?
Yeah, it's such a big question, but if you can try to do it in about 2 minutes, Chris, that'd be awesome.
I tried to set you up for another reference to lightning round, Shawn, but you didn't bite. So, okay, I'll be as fast as I can. So it comes back to the responsibility that I mentioned. I mentioned earlier a little bit of personal responsibility. That's a whole other conversation I'd love to talk with you all about sometime. But 2 other levels of responsibility. One is organizational, and one is community, sort of restoration community-based responsibility. Organizationally, the types of regulatory changes that we've been talking about, oftentimes statutory in nature, super important, foundational to giving basic authorities and basic directions to agencies like mine to do things differently. But it's not enough for cultural change. If you want to have durable changes in how we approach and the speed with which we approach restoration, you need to have cultural change across both regulatory agencies and implementing agencies. A couple quick thoughts on what those look like. Statutory authorities, kind of check that box. We're already really well aware of those. External accountability, you all on this call provide that. Check that box. The 2 others I think are worth other conversations. Organizational policies. We all, as big bureaucratic agencies, big and small rather, have policies internally that really guide our work. And to have baked into those policies these sorts of priorities for getting this good work done in a particular way, at a particular scale, at a particular pace, super important. And lastly, organizational structures. We just underwent a pretty significant reorganization in our shop a couple of years ago, part of which resulted in a brand new division of multi-benefit initiatives. So baked into the name, the very name that folks have on their business cards, is that they are part of an organization whose absolute mission is to implement multi-benefit initiatives at a large scale. Important pieces, all four of those together, really important. Lastly, I'll just say really quickly, I know I'm out of time, but this community scale responsibility. And when I think about that, I think about empathy, urgency, and vision. Empathy, what is it like for me to walk a mile in Chad Dibble's shoes over at CDFW? You know, am I recognizing that his agency was largely built off of the premise that there was unchecked development and environmental degradation in the state of California, and that needed to stop, frankly. And so now we're bringing more complicated projects. Some involve restoration as a primary purpose. That's a big shift. So what does that look like for us to be aware of that and support that and help that transition happen over there? Urgency, are we all on the same page about the climate crisis? Also, are we also on the same page that things don't necessarily have to be done the way they've been done in the past? Are we checking ourselves in the assumptions we're making about how process needs to happen, can happen, should happen? And then lastly, vision. 30 by 30, great example of this. Even if we do more projects, let's say in a region, 100 projects, that all benefit from streamlined restoration permitting. That's fantastic. But a lot of money is put on, there's my flag, a lot of money is put on the fact that were those to be all done with a common vision for that landscape, for both CDFW and for implementing agencies like mine, like 30 by 30, having an eye on that vision with the big end goal is how they relate to each other. That will absolutely pay dividends and benefit the system. So
I'm just going to say empathy, urgency, vision, words to live by in our work and beyond. And I thank you for that. And I look forward to when we can have more of this conversation over a fermented beverage. And until then, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you both. Chris, Kellex, really great conversation. Lots of wonderful nuggets and wisdom out there as we think about the evolution of this work. And just in addition to the empathy, urgency, vision triad, which I think is so important, just this idea that durable change needs that cultural change to go along with it. And that means all those pieces around structure, policies, accountability, and so on and so forth. So thanks for bringing that forward. I think Devin has a couple more questions queued up for us. If you want to try to squeeze those in, Devin, is that still part of the plan?
Yeah, Shawn, we have a bit of an exit evaluation for folks today that I can drop into the chat box here. And everyone online, thank you so much for your time. And we just welcome your further insights. So I'm going to drop a link back into the poll everywhere, and you can take your time just responding to 3 brief questions from all of us. But I think at this point, Shawn, we can bring Deputy Secretary Norris back on for a bit of a look down the road.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Well, the last thing I would say about that last conversation, speaking about really the orange highlighter that Chris had in his sweater, it made me think that, you know, you guys have given me a hard time about wearing plaid at all these events for years. I wonder if we can all show up at the next one with an orange highlighter in our shirt pocket and really give a shout out to a new opportunity to advance collaborative culture through fashion change. So with that, Jen, great to have you back on the screen. That was me just buying some time for you to come back up. We've got so many things happening, right? It's amazing how much we compressed into 2 hours. I can't believe it's been 2 hours, honestly, how much we've learned, how much we've talked about, how much we've connected over content and community and change. Love to hear just your thoughts on what's on your mind as you look down the road, either from your seat or from Natural Resources Agency.
Well, I just want to say thank you for such a great conversation. You know, the cool thing about my job is really it's like 90% cheerleader, 10% support. You know, the people like Chris and Chad, they're the ones doing the hard work on the ground. Madeline, all the people that reported out, Jessica, like they're really like making these things happen. And on Cutting Green Tape, I'm just like, way to go. So here I am saying, way to go. I'm thrilled about just how valuable it is to come together and share information. You know, these are not simple things. It sounds simple, but really when you dig in and try to do it, it's hard. And it's hard for all the reasons we talked about today. But I think the fact that we're all coming together and willing to work on it in this space of mutual understanding and building empathy, as Chris pointed out. I think that's really great. That just makes me really pleased. So looking down the road, you know, we're going to keep marching forward. We have a lot of things. I gave you a little preview of the work that I hope we can report out next. I think the Landscape Stewardship Network, at least I hope, they're going to keep having these convenings so we can have these touch points and this opportunity to continue showcasing our efforts together. I think, yeah, I don't want to say much more. Maybe I'll let you talk about that, Shawn. Do you have things to add on that front?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel very similar to you in the sense that being a part of these is so inspiring, and that my role is such a minor one in it. But I love being connected to the California Landscape Stewardship Network in the sense that we get to help invite all of you to this conversation and to provide the space to explore all these different dimensions, whether it's the bright spots or the challenges or what's coming up or where we need to do additional work, or just to learn from each other, whether that's the content specific stuff or some of the super pithy, exciting insights that you're gaining from colleagues in this space. So all of that is really a privileged position to be a part of this conversation from. I always feel like the facilitator has an honored seat at the table. From the California network perspective, our interest is in continuing to foster these kinds of exchanges, come up with additional resources if they're needed in terms of products, white papers, information sharing, highlighting and sharing bright spots, working with all of you to help advance your interests so that we can achieve things at the pace and scale that we want to have the outcomes that we seek on our landscapes and in our communities and in our seascapes. And I think, you know, one of the ways we want to keep ourselves accountable too is by engaging the academic and research community on learning as we go. And so one of the things that's on the horizon for us is engaging some research partners at Sacramento State on doing a case study of Cutting the Green Tape initiative and making sure that we're capturing those lessons and making the adaptations that can make sure that we're not just doing a lot of things, but we're learning, we're adapting, we're improving, and we're holding ourselves accountable. So it's kind of what's top of mind for me. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add here in closing. We're just scratching or knocking on the door at 3 o'clock. So.
Well, you know, just reiterate, I just want to say thank you. I feel energized and inspired, and I look forward to the next time we meet, reporting out maybe on a bunch of really amazing projects that are moving down the road because of all of our collective good work, because that at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. And, you know, shout out to 30 by 30. Maybe next time we can talk about that. So yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Jen. Here's your contact information, or if you're interested in connecting through the lens of the California network, CLX is really the one that's playing the lead role there. So there are contact information for Jen and for CLX. Special shout out to Devin Landry, who's been helping coordinate these conversations and was our tech jockey behind the scenes today. And then just thank you all for carving out the time. I know that that's one of the most precious commodities we all have right now, and people are extremely busy. So thank you for spending 2 incredible hours with us. Take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you down the road.